Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Law and Legitimacy, and it is the middle of the week. It's hump day. Get on that camel and ride toward the weekend. The world continues to spin on its axis. We're still attached to the world, so that means there are things to look at and marvel over, including the border crisis in Washington. Lots of legal activity yesterday. You are aware, you regular listeners.
Say the border crisis in Washington.
Man, I'm tired. The border crisis in Texas. The border crisis is in Washington.
There is a border crisis in Washington. We need to create a border crisis in Washington.
That's where the Supreme Court sits, and so their failure to resolve or to weigh in on the border crisis in Texas sent the case back to the Fifth Circuit. And so what we have is this ping pong effect. Senate Bill 4, I believe it is, in Texas, permits local law enforcement officers to inquire of a person's immigration status and deport them if they can't satisfy state officials that they're lawfully in the country. The federal government has taken the position, wait a minute, immigration is a federal function and it preempts state action. In other words, we have a comprehensive immigration scheme, that is, a set of laws, rules, and regulations reposed in the federal government, and therefore it is the federal government's power under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution to regulate affairs relating to immigration. As a result of preemption in the Supremacy Clause, the federal government takes the position that local law meaning law arising out of the state of Texas and its police powers, that law, insofar as it encroaches upon or affects an area over which the federal government has control, is invalid. And thus, the federal government has to enjoin or to stop Texas from enforcing that law. The case is percolating its way through the courts and was at the Fifth Circuit, meaning the federal appellate court for Texas. The parties sought review in Washington. The court sent it back to the Fifth Circuit for further proceedings. And last night at about 10 o'clock, the Fifth Circuit, I think, scheduled argument this morning. And the result is that the enjoining of Texas officials from enforcing this law remains in effect. And the result is we have a situation where migrants continue to pour into Texas with impunity, apparently, with apparent lack of resistance from the federal government, an ineffective response, a response that Texas officials find insufficient to protect the interests of Texas people, and Texas is unable to respond. And so it's quite a mess. I suspect that what will happen is the Fifth Circuit will act promptly, and then the case will go promptly back to the Supreme Court. But we've bought at least another 30 to 60 days of chaos there.
Yeah, so you could be forgiven for coming to the stream this morning believing that the Supreme Court had handed the Texas and Attorney General Ken Paxton a win, which it did yesterday. I think the whiplash that I'm feeling this morning is sort of what, how accelerated this 10th Amendment sort of federalism argument has become. And in general, we're talking about an administration that is looking to they hide behind this belief or this argument that they have exclusive jurisdiction to defend and enforce United States sovereign boundaries, our borders. And Texas is arguing under the invasion clause, essentially that the United States government has abrogated its duty. What happened last night is really interesting, Norm, as you say, and even in the in one of the orders the order that was given by the appellate court, the dissenting opinion in that order said very, very strenuously that they didn't understand why this could not have waited until after oral arguments today, right? Mm-hmm. What was the need for the urgency to remove the stay of the injunction, which was enjoining enforcement of SB 4, right? And so it gives this perception from the average person that there is no real law here, right? I think about the average civilian looking at this. I mean, it is whiplash. It is total chaos, total confusion. And it's really interesting because to me, what this ultimately is a demonstration that the federal executive, the current administration, the Biden administration, has a very, very, very deep and abiding commitment to whatever its border policy right now really is, whatever is happening with these millions of illegal crossings and unvetted crossings into the country, the continued busing, the continued flights, etc., right? Creating these sorts of crises in municipalities all over the country with respect to, taxes being allocated toward housing these migrants, etc. I read a story a couple of days ago about a school system looking to allocate funds to shower some of these students that they're now having to put into the school with their general population of students, et cetera. This is wild to me that there's this much aggressive advocacy for this sort of this federal executive power over securing the border when what's going on is the reality of what's happening is complete chaos, right?
Well, yeah, but,
Argue over
that's just
semantics and technicalities, but there's a real crisis happening. And so for the court to be so motivated, the appellate court to be so motivated to undo what the Supreme Court had just done hours earlier, I just color me skeptical of what's going on here.
well, maybe, but I mean, also consider the words you've used: chaos, crisis. Crisis is a Greek term, and all that crisis means is there's a turning point. And sometimes, and I was talking to a good friend not long ago about how lives change. Lives can change in an instant. But what makes the change possible is an accumulation of forces that reach a tipping point. And once that tipping point is changed, those forces are unleashed into the world, and history begins to make sense in hindsight. Perfect example, 9/11. I remember the morning of September 11th, 2001. I was sitting in my office. Somebody called and said, the World Trade Center got bombed or something. And I'm like, oh, come on. And that's my general reaction. Everything is, oh, come on. I'm fine, but the world around you changes. And so I turned on the television in my office, and lo, there was a smoldering World Trade Center. And then suddenly the second one was hit. And in that instant, our worlds changed. We were mobilized and led to see ourselves differently, and to recognize forces and to recognize events in the world that didn't have significance. Personal lives can change that way too. And I understand that all too well. You can cross a threshold at one point and say, wow, there's no looking back. All this has built up over time, and kaboom, here we go. And so I think the border crisis, and it challenges your ideas about yourself, and it challenges your ideas about your place in the world. It challenges your ideas about your relations to others. I will go so far as to say that the border crisis is a tremendous gift to the American people, because realistically, we didn't cause the border crisis to occur. For whatever reason, migrants are flocking into the United States in record numbers and posing challenges to those communities that are hosting them or receiving them as they come in. So the people are coming. Think of Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. The people are coming. They are here. Now, what are we going to do to deal with them? And what we're going to do to deal with them is we're going to respond with the tools at hand. And so the tools at hand, as a matter of constitutional law, consist of the doctrine of federalism and the allocation between state and federal powers. Now, policymakers at both the state and federal levels can have differing commitments and priorities in these responses, and it can yield to conflicts in the law, which is precisely what we're seeing. So I think that the border crisis is an opportunity to apply the Constitution, to apply those principles governing our community to an unforeseen event, and see how the Constitution changes and see how we can accommodate the event. So, to me, there's no, I'm not going to demonize or succumb to the conspiratorial or paranoid impulse and in the interpretation of events. I think there is a tendency in people to attribute agency to events, because when you can attribute agency to events, you can do blame, you can placate, and so on and so forth. I simply think that the border crisis is a matter of the law of large numbers affecting discrete institutions. Large numbers of people are coming over the borders. We have these institutions. God knows what the response will be. So it's a fascinating story.
Mexico expressed its complete displeasure with what the Supreme Court did yesterday. It said categorically that it would not receive any immigrants and any migrants that we deported out pursuant to the lifting of that stay, right, or allowing for the enforcement of SB4. So there was that sort of in a geopolitical context or in a broader context. A couple of things I want to hit here. Number one, Barry Thompson says you'd think that both the state and Fed would both want eliminated illegal immigration instead of squabbling over who can enforce it. Seems Feds don't care about illegal immigration. On the contrary, I think that this demonstrates that the federal government cares immensely about illegal immigration, just not in the direction that you'd have them care, right? And then
Yeah.
the just to continue on with the order that I've got on the screen here, I wanted to read the dissenting opinion, and it's very, very quick, but this is Circuit Judge Andrew S. Oldham. Quote, a preliminary injunction is an extraordinary remedy that alters the status quo. A stay preserves the status quo while appellate court reviews are the lawfulness of that alteration. Earlier today, the Supreme Court of the United States restored an administrative stay so our panel could review the state's request for emergency relief under Federal Rule of Appellate Procedure 8. I would leave that stay in place pending tomorrow's oral argument on the question, right? It demonstrates the sort of absurdity, Norm, that I'm talking about with the timing, right? Why did this court decide all of a sudden, oh, we got to move quickly before oral arguments the following day? It at least gives the impression of some sort of tipping of the scales, right?
Yeah.
And just to follow up a little more on the interest at play here, and I know I'm spending a little more time on this. This is from the bottom of the article that was from the Texas Tribune that really gave us notice that this had been overturned or at least changed overnight. It says, quote, in February, U.S. District Judge David Ezra in Austin blocked SB4, this is some of the procedural history, saying the law, quote, threatens the fundamental notion that the United States must regulate immigration with one voice. Attorney General Ken Paxton's office immediately appealed the ruling to the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which reversed Ezra's ruling. The Biden administration then appealed to the Supreme Court, which temporarily blocked the law until March 18th, as it considered the federal government's request to stop the law from going into effect. In December, the ACLU of Texas, and the Texas Civil Rights Project sued Texas on behalf of El Paso County and two immigrant rights organizations, El Paso-based Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center and Austin-based American Gateways. What? Over the new state law. The following month, the U.S. Department of Justice filed its lawsuit against Texas. The lawsuits have since been combined. Last week, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund and the National Immigration Law Center also filed a lawsuit on behalf of La Union de Pueblo Entero, an advocacy group in the Rio Grande Valley founded by farmer rights activists Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. So what I'm demonstrating here is how many NGOs, nonprofits, that are sort of just funneling themselves around the federal government to preserve whatever is going on with the crisis. And Dawn pointed out earlier, this is another story, Norm, about how Tyson Foods, big chicken supplier, right, to all grocery stores, has begun massive layoffs of existing employees in favor of hiring massive amounts of these newly arrived illegal immigrants in their facilities across the country.
Well, good point about for talking about the material infrastructure and the sort of motives on a macroeconomic level that set a stage for change. I want to honor Dawn's comments about law of large numbers being a statistical concept. I certainly didn't mean to suggest that. I probably should have chosen a better term. In terms of accidents and the role of accidents in history, Dawn, the point simply is that there are sometimes impending forces that an event unleashes and that makes apparent things that were obvious but out of view because we weren't paying attention. And so I think the border crisis reflects that. Let's do a quick pivot to something else. Hey, if you're in Connecticut tomorrow night, show me some love. I'll be at the Mohegan Sun at 10 o'clock at Comics Roadhouse, participating in a competition among stand-up comics. The winner gets a trip to New York and an opportunity to perform there. And I want that opportunity. So turn out if you can, make some noise when I'm on the stage.
Yo-yo at Norm.
AMF Yo-Yo. Yeah, I'll be on the Saint. I guess what I'll refer to as the Saint Odysseus tour. The first leg of that, and it will introduce the struggles of in a comedic form, the struggles of a trial lawyer and his ongoing personal quest for wherever that leads. And I think comedy is a light on the human condition, and lawyers reflect the human condition by their representation of clients and the interest those clients have. That's on the sort of that's tomorrow news. On the distant horizon, I got an invitation to appear in Atlanta on April 27th and April 28th. Destination is known by the person who made it to me. I forgot to write it down. So I'll be performing in Atlanta soon. And if you're down that way, come on out. I'm trying to come out of my shell and out of my skin as a lawyer and show the human side of what it takes to represent people in harm's way, and comedy is the vehicle for that. So come on out, have a good time, have some laughs, learn a little, grow, and learn about one man's search for love. Here we go. Washington's. What's that?
I said, you know where we're going.
I do know where we're going, but I want to make it a surprise when we get there, so I can say, "Holy cow! Holy cow! I didn't know this happened." Mike and I are stepping up the game. We're aggressively on the attack. If you want to show us some support and show us some love, give Mike an email or a text. We are aggressively raising capital to build out this platform and to build out the comedic enterprises. And we'll say more about that in the days, weeks, months to come. Washington State, interesting decision. They rule that the bar exam is no longer a requirement to practice law. It cites the impact on marginalized groups. My bullshit detector just broke. The last thing I want when I walk into a lawyer's office is to have somebody who's there realizing their identity at the expense of my interests. Let's remind people what the law is. The law is a set of rules and concepts that govern, or enforceable rules and concepts that govern the behavior of large groups of strangers who are seeking to live together with settled expectations. It ain't no more than that. You can dress it up with manifestations of the divine will. You can talk about natural law. You can talk about the the emergence of reason in history. You can talk about the Whig interpretation of history. You can talk about dialectical materialism in the interest of capital versus the oppressed workers of the world everywhere. You can talk about all that stuff until your teeth crack. But the fact of the matter is, at a minimum, the law is a set of rules that govern the expectations of people in a community such that we can live together. And that's all it is. And so when you go to a lawyer's office, you're not going there to make a charitable contribution to the lawyer. You're paying the lawyer, presumably, to advise you on what your interests are in a legal regime. You want to form a corporation? How do I do that? What's the cost? What's the benefits? What are the risks? You've been charged with a crime. You have an interest in your liberty. How do I preserve that liberty? What's going to become of me? What's going to happen to me? How do you defend me and maximize my best outcome? You're injured in an automobile accident. Let's say someone has caused me harm. I need compensation. What will the law give me? What are my rights and responsibilities? The person you're talking to across from the desk is not the bearer of an identity. The person who is sitting across the desk from you is a professional, a licensed professional, we hope, a licensed professional who has demonstrated to someone's satisfaction that they are minimally competent to dispense advice, to say, I understand your interest is in freedom, and this is what the law, these are the obstacles you face. I can represent you. These are the steps and the strategic avenues that are open to you. And you can have that conversation. A bar exam assures that every lawyer who hangs a shingle and opens his office to a stranger is at least minimally competent to recognize the interest that the person's presenting within the context of the rule of law. Going to a lawyer's office isn't supposed to be like going to a fortune teller. Any fool can put up a sign and say, hey, come on in, pay me $36.72, and I'll tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. And you know what? Plenty of people will walk in and plunk down the dough, and maybe every now and then somebody will get it right, but more often than not, they're just pulling stuff out of wherever they find it. In this instance, don't we want to say of lawyers that they have minimal requirements? And if members of some marginalized groups have difficulty meeting those requirements, you don't dispense with the requirements. You provide the members of the marginalized group with the opportunities to demonstrate mastery of minimal conditions. So, the Washington State Supreme Court decision to eliminate the bar exam for this reason is absolute madness.
Well, let's talk about, so we've skipped past a couple of things. Number one, what did Washington State do? So under the new guidelines that have been proposed by, I guess, what's called the Bar Licensure Task Force, which was formed in 2020. So a nod to the COVID era insanity there. Put forth new terms and guidelines that the Supreme Court has now upheld. And so under the guidelines, what are they? A 6-month apprenticeship and finishing 3 courses. You must complete a minimum of 3 hours of legal work per week and 12 skills credits as licensed legal interns, so garnering up to 500 hours. And then the eligibility to become a lawyer or a licensed practitioner can also extend to law clerks if they haven't finished law school by completing the 500 hours of work as a licensed legal intern. So why did they do this? Which, first of all, that's absurd. And I think about 500 hours, Norm. I think I did the math yesterday. 500 hours, if we're generous and we call it 8 hours a day, is something like 62 and a half days. Right? And so that's equivalent of what? Every day, maybe you could stretch it about 3 months, but 500 hours of licensed legal intern, apprenticeship, whatever, and a few courses. This is insane. And so my view on this, I'll get to in a second, but is much more cynical than I think what our viewers are thinking here for the moment. But here goes, I guess, the reasoning for why they came to this decision. They say, quote, that the bar is minimally effective for ensuring competency and, quote, disproportionately and unnecessary blocks marginalized groups from becoming practicing attorneys. According to the spokesman review, after appointing the task force in 2020 to assess disproportionate impacts on examinees of color and first-generation examinees, the courts agreed to substitute the exam with, quote, experiential learning alternatives. So here's what's going on, Norm. Seriously, this is what's happening. Law school has become so prohibitively expensive that we don't need to go into that. We know. And that's not just unique to law. That's unique. It goes the same for pharmacy school, dental school, any sort of undergraduate biological sciences track into a graduate field. Very expensive, prohibitively so. However, law is now guided by a notion in law schools and their admissions policies. And I'm speaking from a place of experience here because I graduated from Charlotte School of Law. Nobody had a bigger chip on their shoulder coming out of an accredited ABA institution than I did, because it's not even a...
That's the Harvard of nowhere, folks. I mean...
But I'm being very serious about that. Nobody had a bigger chip on their shoulder about what they needed to earn in the practice of law or as a practitioner than me and my colleague. And for that reason, I can say from experience that the sort of for-profit veneer that was applied to Charlotte School of Law and that consortium of schools was done by Above the Law and all of these other sort of institutional rags that protect the pedigreed institutions, the tier 1 institutions. But what's really happening is these pedigreed and tier 1 institutions are being required through admission standards to admit students that are not likely to succeed in matriculating through graduation and are much less likely to actually pass a bar exam for licensure. But because the money is so good to have federally backed student loans to the tune of $60,000, $70,000 per year, what's being done here is they are choosing the curriculum in the institution as being what we're going to preserve, rather than preserving the one threshold criteria that is cost effective to determine whether somebody could actually become a lawyer after doing some sort of apprenticeship model that's being proposed here. So rather than actually getting rid of the ABA accreditation requirement for certain bar exams or whatever else, and saying, hey, we're going to do this, but if you can pass this standardized exam, you'll be a licensed attorney, provided you do these other criteria. What's actually happening is they're protecting the bag. They're just protecting the money. These institutions know that their admission standards have lowered so far, right, that they're not able to bring in statistically the demographics that they claim to serve, right? This noble pursuit of representing underrepresented groups from historical backgrounds of prejudice, discrimination, etc. What's actually happening is they are tripping over themselves trying to find ways to legitimize whoever is graduating, and they're unwilling to face the music of merit-based assessments of who should be licensed to practice. And who ultimately loses here, Norm? Not the people taking on tremendous mountains of debt, right? They are victims, if we want to talk about that. The real losers are the people out in the market who need cost-effective and affordable legal representation from a criminal perspective, from a civil perspective, estate planning and probate, all of that kind of stuff. You're actually starting to put a regime together that is going to produce incompetent attorneys who are not able to critically think about fact patterns. And you and I both know, Norm, how dynamic fact patterns can be on a case-by-case basis. And it's not a one-size-fits-all, right?
All
This
right.
like form request culture that we live in, right, is being put on steroids right now.
Well, let's look back at this again later. I mean, it's an interesting issue. You raised some interesting points. I mean, you're always bringing the economic perspective to bear in ways that I don't, and I appreciate that. Hey, what's going on with Trump and Truth Social? Are we seeing electronic warfare launched on Donald Trump? Truth Social has been down since late yesterday. It was down at least as of 5 a.m. this morning, and nobody seems to know why. What do you know, Mike? What's the latest?
I don't know any more than Newsweek or anybody else on X, and it appears, this is one of the downfalls of the Truth Social platform not having an account on somewhere like X or I haven't checked Instagram or Facebook, but my assumption is that Truth Social has a sort of principled stance that it's not going to be available for anything. But there are, I guess, Truth Social posts. There is an account on X from Trump himself, but that's not giving any updates here. I think, my big question here is sort of similar to yours, I think, which is, what is the destiny of our 2024 election cycle, Norm? If we've seen widespread blackouts and widespread outages of social media platforms and various technologies in the last several weeks, in particular, and this has been happening for the last 6 months at least, in my short-term memory. But what's really interesting about this is in the news right now is a number of things. Stormy Daniels' new documentary, or her new film that she's promoting all around, all along New York City. We've got the Letitia James show, which is, applying interest rates or interest on top of the debt of $300 and some million for a grand total of whatever. And now there's reports that Trump can't come up with that kind of cash, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but what's being precluded by this outage, if there is some sort of if this is not sort of an organic failure, right, the whole platform going down, this is sort of I guess a foreshadowing, if you will, of what the quiet will look like if Trump is unable to communicate directly with the demos that he seeks to communicate with during this election cycle. This is troubling.
Well, I'd like to know exactly what happened, and I hope we get an answer on that. My suspicion is that this was Trump targeted because it's Trump, and it was a desire to silence him and a desire to keep him from communicating with. Oh, Nate, yeah, absolutely. Put that post back out there. It's an effort to break his communicative link, because as we've said to you before 1,000 times, and let's make this 1,001 for Nate the lawyer. Trump wasn't elected president in 2016 because he will go down as among the latest and greatest statesmen in world history. The guy was a reality TV star. He made it to the White House because he was a canary in the coal mine, and the draft in the coal mine made people wary. And there's a lack of a sense of cohesion and community. Donald Trump appealed to it, and he drew voters to himself for that reason. I think there's a desire to silence him and to silence the populist instinct, because there's a lack of a recognition of what makes communities cohesive, and people are struggling in their communities for a sense of cohesiveness. Cohesiveness. I want to do a quick pivot, Mike. Something we forgot to talk about today. I had one of the most remarkable experiences of the last 4 or 5 years of my life last night. No, I didn't get laid. But I went to a state hockey final. I'm living with the family of a good friend right now while my life is in tatters, because of an impending divorce and so forth. And so we go to a hockey game, state championship hockey game, the West Haven Notre Dame versus New Canaan. This is Connecticut. And, it's a beautiful spectacle. It's a great arena. It was at the Quinnipiac College or University facility. But what made the event special was sitting and watching the crowd and listening to the discussions and realizing that this high school, Notre Dame of West Haven, has been a place that people have gone to flourish and nurture one another for years. And so they had come out, multiple generations of people with an affective bond to New Haven, to celebrate the team and to root. And they cared passionately about it. So behind us sat a couple of men, even older than me, and it's hard to find them these days, who were bitching and moaning about this, that, and, complaining about games from 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I was filled with something like envy, because I thought this was a community of people who were bound together by common interest. That is the past that they shared, and had, well, in this case, common conceptions of right, not in the sense of what's justice, but in the sense in which sports brings out a tribal influence in us. So they were rooting for their team. And in the course of that evening, in the ups and downs of a competitive game, the crowd reacted depending on where their affections lied. And for a moment, individuals lost their sense of isolation and became one with others. And the losers mourned and the winners triumphed. And so sports, I think, becomes a window into a sense of community. And the very thing that Cicero was talking about, a constitution, a commonwealth, like res publica, a public thing, is not just any collection of individuals, but it's a collection of people bound together by common interests, and one could say a past, and a common conception of right. And in sports, we cut to the chase. We say right is winning. It's a limited experience. It's like a man looking for love between the legs of a prostitute. You won't find it there, but you'll find the illusion of it for a moment or two. And so I would encourage people who are trying to figure out what can we do to repair the fissures in this country, to consider the affective bonds that are created by rooting for local sports teams. I'm not talking about, the Dallas Cowboys or the New York Giants or, the Charlotte Hornets, if you're foolish enough to vote for a team in North Carolina. I'm talking about local communities where people worked together, lived together, studied together, raised families together, buried their loved ones as they died together. And they do so under the shell, not of ideological commitments, but under the shell of effective bonds that nourish them and provide them with a sense of place in the world. So, congratulations to Notre Dame West Haven for winning last night. But more to the point, congratulations to that community, which coheres in space and time in the midst of a world that seems off of its axis, and provides a sense of place to people in which they can enjoy the shelter of one another's arms, the companionship of hearts alive to shared experience, and if only for a moment, a sense of unity in a world where diversity and conflict seems to be the norm. I left that hockey game thinking it was a great game. It was fun. But I left that with a real sense of respect for what a community is and what it can do for individuals. So congratulations again. And, those of you groping for place, take a look at your local sports communities and see what's what,
I love it. I love it, Norm. I love hearing you talk so poetically about youth sports in particular. But what I would say is that, don't cheapen what these young men learn about themselves and one another and the links to which they will go in order to overcome whatever adversity is in front of them. And they do so under the guidance and the leadership of the men standing behind them. Right. So as much as we're focused
No,
on
that's true.
this image of the young guys and what will be an enduring memory for them forever. And none of us know the cumulative effect of the early mornings, the late nights, the sacrifices made, the adversities that they overcome, and even the losers in this game have that same thing in common. What I want to point to is sort of the leadership of the men and the cohesion that they have given these young men and the discipline that they've given these young men to step into whatever the structure of sports ultimately is and realize something greater about themselves and their capacity to change their station than they would have otherwise realized in the wild.
Well, very good. Hey, Dawn McNeil suggests joining a pickleball club. I've seen it change lives. I'll bet you have, Dawn. I mean, somebody walks in perfectly capable, hobbles out on crutches in need of Advil, or a couple that's been happily or at least unhappily or contentedly married for 55 years decides to divorce when it turns out she can kick his ass 6 ways by Sunday using her left hand rather than right. Pickleball will bring out the genius in everyone. Hey, we've talked our way through another half an hour of your lives. Thank you for tuning in. Spread the word. We're here. We mean to play. And we have bold aspirations. we don't think we're going to save the world, but we're going to study it, and we're going to reflect what we see in it, because we think we live in a broken world. We think the political system is broken. We think the social system is strayed. We think there are forces unleashed in the world that make your lives, our lives, sometimes difficult to understand and comprehend fully. But as Socrates once said, the point was not to live, but to live well. And while we may be but wayfarers in the vale of tears we call reality, there is satisfaction to be found in the embrace of one another. There is satisfaction to be found in building a better world. And candidly, I'll go so far as to say there is satisfaction to be found in having the courage to love. Sometimes you need to learn lessons in all the wrong places in all the wrong ways to be open to these things, but we're open and we're learning, and we mean to share what we're learning with you. So come on back tomorrow. Mike, how do people find us?
We're here every day, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on X, YouTube, and Rumble, at LawPod Daily and at Law and Legitimacy on Rumble. You can also find the audio-only versions of this stream uploaded directly after the stream is over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, Overcast, wherever you find your premium podcasts. What we ask that you do is hashtag AMFYoYo wherever you find us, and leave us a review over there and 5 stars. And if you don't have anything nice to say, just, leave us alone, man.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I'm off to court, where life is, as Thomas Hobbes once said, nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. And, but it's a living, and somebody's got to do it. See you tomorrow, folks.
See you tomorrow, Norm. Bye, everybody.